This is called Joe's Boy, the in-between years. He had ideas, this bloke. He was never sure. He was an artist and a philosopher. Well, that's how he saw himself anyway. And what good is an artist or a philosopher without an original thought, eh? People like that tend to become critics or DJs or the artist's agents. People who make their living lauding it over the real talent. Well, Jesse, he was the real deal. That fact should have been obvious to everybody right from the off. He'd trained as a chippy under the tutelage of his father, but he'd always known that he was destined to be more than that. He had something, you see, something special. Everybody had said so. Now, Joe, he was just your average bloke. He hadn't wanted much out of life to provide for his family, keep the line going and have a couple of weeks by the sea every summer. That was about it. But he tried to envisage his son taking over the family business once he'd retired. But the boy, he was messy, undisciplined, head in the clouds most of the time. He had his own way of doing things and he wouldn't be told. No, he always thought he knew best. It'll get him into trouble one day. He'd warned him that on more than one occasion. This superiority complex of his. People don't like an upstart, he told him, especially not one from his kind of stock. Joe remembered the trouble he'd caused that day when they tried to open him a savings account. Never could learn to keep his ideas to himself, never had learned to keep his trap shut. He'd done his best with it, he really had. He'd taught him everything he knew, but Jesse, he could never be happy with a finely crafted dovetail joint, no. Everything had to be freeform and unique with him, no 2 chairs a pair and all that hippie bull. But people loved him for it. Joe could never see the attraction in wonky tables or dressers with mismatched drawers. It wasn't traditional, you understand. It wasn't right. But the boy, he had something of an enigma about him, and he was bringing in the money, sure, but what was it doing to the family name in the process? He was no son of his, which was technically true, although Jesse hadn't known that back then. Marie had been pregnant when they'd met, and although Joe had brought him up as his own, it was becoming ever clearer to both of them that he was never going to be a chip off the old step block. They'd spoiled him as a kid, overindulged him, nothing they could do about that now. They'd made their bed, created their monster. It was their fault, really, that Jesse was turning out the way he was. Now, that often happens with an only child. Parents tend to overcompensate, but you see, Jesse, he wasn't an only child. He was, however, the only one whose lineage was in doubt. He hadn't meant to tell him, he really hadn't, and it never should have come out the way it had, but Joe and Marie's marriage had been going through a bit of a rocky patch, and well, Jesse had never been one to stifle an opinion, which was making things worse. If he was being really honest, then Joe had to admit that he was a little resentful of Jesse's relationship with Marie. It was a tad edible for his liking. A boy of that age shouldn't be quite that familiar with his mother, even one as camp as Jesse was. So he'd told him, it had just slipped out, and he hated himself for saying it, though he also felt strangely relieved that the elephant was no longer in the room. Well, it had shut the boy up, that was for sure. First and only time he'd ever seen him lost for words. He'd arrived for work a bit late that morning, Joe having had to drop the 2 younger off at school on his way through. It had been a fraught journey, the kids bickering all the way there, their reaction to the pointless domestic that had been stupidly allowed to escalate over breakfast. When Joe had entered the workshop, he found that Jesse had commandeered the bulk of the prime timber that was needed to finish the job that they'd been working on all week, attacked it with a chisel and fashioned it into some kind of abstract sculpture of a beardy bloke in a dress with his arms held horizontally from his body like one of those bloody Baptist types. Now, Joe's temper had got the better of him, and he'd snapped, calling the bastard a bastard before he even knew what he was doing. Jesse had just stared at him, mute and unreadable. "Well, say something," Joe had eventually said, a little scared now. Since he was being honest, he could finally admit to himself that the boy had always scared him a little bit. It was that far away, older than his years, wise man look of his, an affectation that had always ensured him what he wanted from Marie and, well, just about everybody else he'd come into contact with too. "I forgive you, Father," were the last words he heard from his adopted son. Jesse put his tools back on the workbench, pulled his coat from its hook and left without looking back. He's 25, he told his wife. It's about time he stood on his own 2 feet. He can't hang on your apron strings forever, you know. But he's too sensitive for this world, Marie argued. They'll crucify him out there. The following 4 weeks were agonising for the family. Marie refusing to speak to her husband, the 2 young children bickering constantly, and Joe out of his mind with worry and regret, until eventually one evening, Joe had come home to find Marie weeping tears of joy. Her son had finally been in touch. He was living in the city in a squat with his mates, 13 of them in some kind of commune situation, but he was happy, and that was all that mattered to Marie. He'd grown a beard and taken to wearing a lot of white. Joe just at that bit. And he was writing a book, apparently, although he hadn't gone into details, and had made it his life's mission to find his real dad. Joe was surprised at just how much that revelation had pained him. But you don't know who his father was, he reminded her. Just a bloke, you said, no one special. A one-night stand. Is there something you're not telling me, Marie? I was pissed all right. I didn't see his face, Marie bellowed. It was a row that they'd reenacted several times over the past 25 years. Every time, in fact, that Jessie had done something to wind Joe up. So if you don't know who he was, how the fuck does he think he's going to find him? Joe snapped back. Marie faltered, and Joe raised an eyebrow at his tentative wife. He's got this idea in his head, she explained sheepishly, embarrassed to recount what her favourite son had told her. He said he can't accept that I would have done that sort of thing out of wedlock. Joe harumphed indignantly and folded his arms over his chest. He's got it into his head that it was God. God? Joe snapped. What? Oh, Jehovah? He shook his head in a play of mock surprise. Okay, so this Jehovah rocks up at Ruth's hen night then? I don't know, he was probably the stripper ground. He spots you dancing round your handbag, he slips you a few shots, waits for you to fall over, then takes you out into the chariot park and gives you one over the back of his donkey. Joseph Christmas, you stop that right now. He's not right in the head, you know that, don't you? Marie's tears, you're getting this, you know which story. So that's why my default Jewish hat works tonight, actually. Marie's tears turned from joy to pain, and Joe hugged her to his breast, whispering apologies into her hair. He's a good boy, she wept. He's just a little bit special. She blew her nose into his shoulder. He'll be all right, won't he? Well, time went by. Joe continued to work while Marie kept house. Jessie stayed away and rarely came up in conversation, but unbeknownst to her husband, Marie had been secretly meeting up with her son every couple of weeks in a little kosher deli on Nazareth High Street. He'd been reading her bits from his book. He was calling it Torah 2, the next phase. He claimed merely to be ghostwriting it, though, taking dictation from his real dad, God. Marie had done her best to dissuade him of this notion. She decided to be honest with him. Look, she'd said, it's very sweet of you to write me into your story, but I haven't always been this paragon of virtue that you're trying to sell me as. I was a bit of a goer in my time, you know. She closed her hands over his. She hadn't even told her husband this. Look, there was this bloke I used to know, she explained. He was a bit of a bastard, but that's how I liked him back then. He had a wicked sense of humour and a really hypnotic personality. He was the cellar man down at the Fallen Angel over in Bethlehem. And what was this debauched fornicator's name? Jessie asked, licking the nib of his pencil. Stan, his mother replied. Stumpy Stan. I think he works for Darkside Breweries these days. Stan's your man, son. He's your biological father. No, said Jessie simply. No, mother. And he smiled serenely, or possibly dim-wittedly, depending on your ability to read autistic facial expressions. My father resides, he patted his chest lightly, in here. Jessie, Marie pleaded, listen to your mother. It's about time you settled down and started a family. This Mary that you're living with, she seems like a nice Jewish girl. Mother, I've already told you, it's Jude that I love. And I told you, son, Jude is a boy. Have you not read your Leviticus? Now put that pencil away, you'll get yourself into trouble. Marie picked up his book and dropped it into her shopping bag. She stood up, threw 5 pieces of silver onto the table to cover the cost of the coffee and the bagels, and turned to leave. Cut your hair, put some trousers on and get yourself a job, she said. I'll see you in a fortnight. Marie! Marie! Joe exclaimed, throwing the evening paper down on the table in front of her. They've arrested our Jessie. Marie picked it up and stared at the picture of her son on the front cover. Apparently, he'd been caught doing magic tricks in the market again. The old wine into water routine and the thin sliced loaf ruse. He'd been warned about it before, but the only voice he ever listened to was the one in his head. Stupid bastard, only went and told him he was the son of God, didn't he? They'll string him up. Marie was crying. It says here, Joe read on, that as well as conjuring stuff, he's been teaching people lessons from some holy book. Did you know about this? I warned him about making a spectacle of himself, she said between sobs and sniffles. He was only trying to help people. He just wants everyone to be nice to each other. What planet's he on? This is Judea, 31 AD. People are bastards. People have always been bastards. And people always will be bastards. I took it off him, Marie whined. I knew it'd get him into trouble. Well, then he's obviously written some more, hasn't he? A thought that suddenly struck him. Where is it? They'll be round here soon. Pilot doesn't like to be undermined. Marie pulled Jessie's book from her bag. What are you going to do with it? It's all right. I know a bloke who makes things disappear, he replied, tapping the side of his nose. And I don't mean a 2-shekel magician down the market, neither. It had been Jude who had turned him in. They'd all been having supper together one evening when Jude had felt Jessie's hand alight on his knee, under the table, and give a little squeeze. Now the cult stuff he could live with, all that doing unto others malarkey, he could go with that, and Mary, she was well into it, and if he wanted to stand a chance of getting into her knickers, he had to at least look like he was into it as well, but he was into that. And maybe with Jessie out of the way, he could be the Messiah. And Mary would be up and under his smock before anyone could say that Jessie is a very naughty boy. He hadn't expected them to nail him to a cross though. Bit extreme, Rome, eh? What was wrong with a quick lashing or light stoning these days? No sense of proportion, these Romans. Jude decided to get out before people started to put 2 and 2 together. He'd come back when people had forgotten Jessie and it had all blown over. Now, it was a while after this when Shifty John, Joe's wily mate, wondered to himself whether there might actually have been something to this Jessie bloke and his ramblings after all. He'd noticed that Pilate, the local Roman governor, was losing the fight to quell the Jewish dissenters who were well pissed off with him for putting a special needs kid to death just for being a bit enigmatic. So John decided that maybe the kid had been onto something after all. So he went back up to the cave in the mountain where he'd hid all the stuff that he was paid to lose, and he dug out Jessie's book. He showed it to Jessie's mate Mary, who had luckily nabbed the remaining chapters and kept them hidden in a lingerie drawer. Well, they changed the names to protect the innocent, obviously. Filled in the gaps and published it under a pseudonym, inadvertently kicking off a whole new religion in the process. Oh, and they changed the name of the book as well. Thank you.
Yeah.